This time we're going to look at a really, really eye-opening insight from a 20th century scholar named Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, the Shiurei Da'as. He was a rabbi in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. It's either Chicago or Detroit. I always mix up those two cities. They're both in the Midwest somewhere. They're not New York. That's basically where they are. And the main gist of this piece is going to be about the rituals that we do at the seder. Who amongst you can tell me what are the things that we do at the seder to signify freedom? Yeah.
We lean.
We lean. Great. We lean.
Matzah.
Matzah. It's an interesting one. So in our first session on freedom, we said it is both slavery and freedom. But yes, well, I'll accept it. It's like what is it? Family Feud, where they have the subject, the topic on the board. Well, we'll take it. We'll allow it. Judges will allow it. Yeah. Okay. We've got leaning, matzah. What else? The wine. The 4 cups of wine signify freedom. Maror is probably the only answer I would not allow. That's the slavery. That's the bitterness of the slavery. It's not freedom. Charoset is a tough one. And I'm going to speak about that tomorrow night at our campus event about the significance of the foods. Charoset. The charoset is both. The charoset signifies the bricks and mortar. It's supposed to look like the bricks and mortar, but it's also okay. I won't get into it because it's a complicated one. What else? We've got most of them, and also just the fact that we're eating and we recline as we eat, and there's a nice custom. If you've done this before, to have somebody else pour your cup of wine, like you're a free person, like you're a royalty almost. So there are quite a few things. Rabbi Bloch's major question is going to be the following. It's actually interesting. I have a good friend who is a bit of a character. He's like over the top in everything that he does. His sense of humor, his elaborate, the way in which he sets things up. One time I went to a Pesach Seder of his, and he literally put 6 couches around the table and had everyone reclining at the Seder. At his wedding, he's such a nut job. He had little clown noses on every glass at every seat and made everyone wear a clown nose for the entire wedding, including his rabbis. It was... No, he's not from Philadelphia. No, it's not Rick.
That's a great idea. I like someone from Philadelphia.
So he actually asked the question that Rabbi Bloch is now going to answer. And the question is this. If you're supposed to really get into the mood of freedom, really feel what it means to be free, then let's make it a lot more experiential. Let's make it a lot more integrative and all-encompassing. Let's put on a whole theatrical production here of the Exodus from Egypt. If you want to convey freedom, would you say that the best way to encapsulate that is to do this? No. This is slaves. This is free. This is slavery. This is freedom. He says, what's the deal? Why is it so subtle? Why is it so slight? Is that the best we can come up with to demonstrate our freedom? That's his question. Okay? Good? Yeah. Great. Good. Let's begin. There's a lot to get through. I hope we're going to get through it. We don't have that much time, but let's do it. In the parsha of the Sota, you know what the Sota is? The woman who is suspected of having cheated on her husband. Okay? It says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if any man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him, the man shall bring his wife to the priest, the Kohen, and he shall bring as an offering for her 1/10 of an ephah, that's a measurement, a volume, of barley flour, barley kemach. No oil shall be poured upon it, and no frankincense shall be laid upon it. And Rashi there says, kemach, flour, implies that it shouldn't be fine sifted flour, because that would be another word, soles, I think. So it has to be coarse barley flour that she brings as an offering for this supposed sin. It must be barley and not wheat, because she committed a animalistic act. Therefore, shall her offering consist of that which is food for beasts, because because they used to feed barley to their animals and not to their humans. He shall pour no oil upon it, so that her offering shall not be embellished. And also because oil is called light, whilst she acted in darkness. Nor shall he put frankincense, because the matriarchs are symbolically termed frankincense, as it is said, I will get me to the hill of frankincense. So all of these little hints and allusions to light versus darkness, to the matriarchs, to humans versus animals, all of these are encoded in the offering that's brought for the sota. The simple understanding of the text is clear, that all of this is to degrade the act of the sota and to make it despised in order to make an impression on the woman so that she clearly recognizes the wickedness of the act. Or it is for the sake of those who are watching and listening, so that it makes an impression on them, so that they will recognize the wickedness of the act and distance themselves from it. It is thus required that the sacrifice be made in the manner so that it will light. It is thus required that the sacrifice be made in the manner so that it will highlight the sinfulness of these deeds. But something does not sit well with us. Was it not possible to find a more obvious and recognizable sign, which might make an even stronger visceral impression? Aren't these signs nearly impossible to pick up on? So what impression could there possibly be from them? It's a good question. Are you sitting there and like researching and analyzing there was no frankincense on the offering. That's because the frankincense is a symbolism for the matriarchs, and she wasn't like is anybody in the audience thinking that? It's a fantastic question, no? And I think that applies to a lot of the rituals that Jewish people do, which is like sometimes they're so abstracted from what they're trying to convey that who in their right minds is thinking the thing that the ritual is trying to teach us. Mm-hmm. You get the question? Great. Yeah. However, it is important to know that the impression that small symbols like these leave are not as weak as we may have imagined. Even if they are not strongly felt, nonetheless, it leaves a real impression on one's being and acts upon it, as we know that there are many stimuli that act upon a person's internal stirrings without one being aware of them at all. We see all the time that a person acts without paying any attention, and it seems that no arousal of any kind of will had caused the person to do it. Now, I find this absolutely amazing. He was writing this in the 60s. This was like 20 years before Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky got together to come up with behavioral economics, which essentially tracked this idea that people act in irrational ways based on small little cues that they pick up from in their surroundings. I'm sure many of you have heard, if you haven't heard of Kahneman and Tversky, I'm sure many of you have heard of the experiments they did, where they will spin a wheel that has a bunch of numbers on it, and it'll land on a random number. And then they'll ask the test subject, what percentage of the countries in the United Nations are African countries? And what they found was that if the wheel, which had arbitrarily landed on some random number, was a higher number, they'll guess a higher number. And if it was on a lower number, they guess a lower number. The test subject knows that it has absolutely no correlation to the actual number of African countries in the United Nations, but there's a human psychological condition called anchoring, where if you throw out a number, that will influence people's decision-making shortly thereafter. It's an incredible thing. So we pick up on these cues all the time, and this is exactly what Rabbi Bloch is telling us, is that the more subtle the hint is in the ritual, the more it penetrates deeply into our subconscious. And that's essentially going to be the answer. We see all the time that a person acts without paying any attention. It seems that no arousal of any kind of will had caused the person to do it. But it cannot make sense that a person acts without having any sort of arousal in him or her. There has to be some sort of awakening. There has to be some sort of, some sort of response, right? Where one could find some force that catalyzes that act. We find, therefore, that there are imperceptible arousals, things that arouse our inner attention, that act within a person's being without being aware of it at all. The subconscious. There's another thing called priming. I'm sure many of you have heard of the idea of priming. They did another experiment where they had these people, ostensibly the subjects thought that they were taking some sort of a test on a computer. But as they got there, the screensaver was doctored, so that half of them had like a random screensaver of, abstract shapes, and the other half had a screensaver where it was dollar bills floating across the screen. Okay, that was the only change that they made in the experiment. Now, one of the proctors of the test, one of the testers, would walk into the room with a cup of pencils, and they would pretend that they tripped and fell and spilled all the pencils on the floor. Now, these test subjects were taking a test on their computer, and they thought that the better they do on the test, the more money they'll get, something like that. They tested what percentage of the test subjects would stop their test and help the tester to pick up all the pencils. Turns out that the people who had gotten the money screensaver were less likely to help the person pick up the pencils because they had been primed to think about money.
Interesting.
It's incredible. It's unbelievable. Now I want you to think about all the stimuli that you encounter all the time in your society. What are the cues that are being given to you by your culture? There was one saying that was about 20, 30 years old that says, if Americans were honest about what they worshipped, they would have stained glass windows on their banks.
Yeah.
So it's this unspoken, but very obvious, but also unspoken rule that what we worship is financial success. And all the cues in your environment are in a very subtle way influencing you to say, well, that's obviously what I value the most. It's an incredible thing. Incredible thing. So these can be used for bad or for good. Once you're aware that things can penetrate your subconscious, you can use that in a nefarious way, subliminal messaging, all kinds of stuff like that, or you can use it to your advantage by intentionally placing positive cues in your environment so that it will affect you positively. All of this has inspired in me a novel thought, something that is perhaps the exact opposite of what we are accustomed to thinking, but it appears to be true. It is possible that the desired outcome can only be achieved through things like these that do not cause any noticeable reaction, but only leave subtle impressions. In other words, the more obvious the cue, the less deeply it penetrates. The less obvious and the more subtle and the more imperceptible the cue, the deeper it goes. It's an amazing idea. When greater, more affective spectacles occur, sorry, I skipped a line. It is possible that the desired outcome can only be achieved through things like these that do not cause any noticeable reaction, but only leave subtle impressions which reach the fine filaments of the soul and awaken them. When greater, more affective spectacles occur, even at the moment of their occurrence, it looks like they make a greater impression on a person and bring him or her to an overwhelming emotional change, but in truth, they are not usually so effective. Precisely because they only touch the external part of the person. And that's what causes them not to penetrate deeply enough to touch the person's finer qualities, only through the subtle, unnoticeable impressions, which do not arouse us or bring some great response. Those reach the desired finer qualities. I had a teacher a long time ago who used to be in filmmaking and script writing, and I asked him early in my Jewish career, why don't you make an awesome movie about Jews? Just make something that's so, I know you spend all this time teaching Judaism to individuals, but you could reach so many more people if you just made an incredible movie about Judaism and Jews. He said, I thought about it. And then I remembered that on the whole, for the most part, most movies go like this. You spend 2 years making a film. Millions of dollars advertising, marketing, publicity. The average moviegoer sits down in the theater, watches it for 2 hours, and 2 hours later they've forgotten the whole thing. Obviously you don't forget the movie, but it's barely made a dent because it's so short and it feels very dramatic in the moment. But how much has it touched you? Only the things that slowly make etchings on your soul over time, consistently, over a long period of time, that's really what changes us. So he said, I'd rather reach 20, 30, 40 people a year, but have a much more powerful impact on them than spend an entire year writing a movie that's gonna barely move the needle. So, okay. Similarly, I became aware of this with regards to the Pesach Seder, which was arranged entirely as a remembrance and awakening of the concept of the Exodus from Egypt. We eat while leaning as a remembrance of freedom. Maror without leaning to remember they have bittered their lives. Matzah as a remembrance of the poor bread, so too with the shankbone and all the other aspects of the night. They are small, undramatic signs, which are repeated again and again every year. One would imagine that it would be even more powerful and more inspiring if the inhabitants of each city joined together in a great feast with music and speeches in honor of the day. Would it not be even greater if they created a theatrical production to reenact the whole story of the Exodus from Egypt and to illustrate in detail all of the hardships of the slavery, the bricks and mud, etc., such that we would remember even more clearly the Exodus and would have a much more powerful effect than simply eating maror or leaning? No wonder the wicked son asks us, what is this service to you? He's like, this is a joke, man. Like, what are we doing here? What are we, this is so weak. This is lame. And speaking of maror, right? I know the hardcore, diehard, hot wing enthusiasts in the room love to stick that white horseradish straight into their mouths to see how much they can consume and one-up their friends. But do you know what maror is? Do you know what the maror of the Talmud is? Romaine lettuce. That's the most ideal maror that you can come up with, is romaine lettuce. You know what romaine lettuce is? It's a crunchy, leafy vegetable that has a slightly bitter aftertaste. And that's what we choose as the ideal ritual to signify the horrific bitterness of Egyptian slavery. Why? Why? Well, now we have our answer. Let's go to the last paragraph on the next page. But in truth, if we were to make a seder in such a fashion, with the whole theatrical production, even though we would certainly return from that feast or theater and feeling inspired and emotional, still the external parts of us would devour it. Only the outside of us, the superficial conscious of our intellect, would say, wow, that was amazing, that was awesome, I'm going to remember that. One who came from this feast would remember everything he saw with great passion. But that one firm seed, the impression on the inner soul, would be swallowed up and last amongst the superficial spectacle that catches a person's simpler and baser perceptions. Specifically in this Seder, with matzah and maror, leaning and 4 cups of wine and other mitzvahs, which our sages instructed us to perform as a way to remember the Exodus from Egypt, which don't bring a person to overt inspiration, can that firm seed find its place and awaken the soul of man and have the effect that the Seder is meant to have. What amazing. These people are so awesome. You're right. We could have an incredible musical, Exodus, the Prince of Egypt, live on the West End, on Broadway, right at your home. That could have been Seder night. Everyone go to a theater. But it wouldn't do the same thing. Because while it would have the external impact that we all feel when we've witnessed a spectacle, it wouldn't be fine enough. It wouldn't be subtle enough to reach the inner recesses of our soul. And so it wouldn't have that lasting impact for change that we do get when we make small, subtle, imperceptible rituals. The act of leaning, just this small thing, the ability to just rest your hand on your head on your hand, that says it all. You know, in Egypt, they didn't even have a moment's rest. They didn't have a moment to pause. Sometimes all it takes is just a sigh, just a breath, to realize that you have the luxury of rest. So we have to look for the tiny, tiny, tiny little details in our Seder and say, those are the things that are actually going to impact us in the greatest way. Not the, I love it. I love it. The Sfardis, the Sephardi custom is they walk around some of them walk around with massive, heavy backpacks around the seder table, right, to feel the heaviness. And other times they'll take a leek or whatever, and they'll hit each other, right? You smack each other. So it's great. It's amazing. It's fantastic. But those are later additions, right? And I love that. I think it's great. I think it's really great for the kids, but it's also great for the adults. But in reality, the mainstays, the most important parts of the Seder are those tiny little details, the things that we look at as really very lame and uninspiring parts of the Seder. Those are actually the things that have the greatest impact on us.
Like the egg.
The egg.
Why is the egg there?
Why is the egg there? Do you know?
I have a
Anyone?
theory. Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's because I'm not sure if this is true. I heard this from someone. This is not my own theory.
Okay.
Basically, we put an egg, a hard-boiled egg, because as Jewish people, like the egg, the more pressure we have on us, the harder we get.
Yes, that's right. There is some deep idea, right, that some things get softer through boiling.
Well, that's the main reason.
Right. Some things get softer through boiling. Some things get harder through boiling, and the egg gets harder through boiling. Now, the significance of the egg, there's a couple reasons for the egg. One is that it's supposed to represent one of the sacrifices of the night. One is the idea that the egg is actually a food of mourning. So in a house of mourners, they have hard-boiled eggs, and they also have chickpeas. They have round foods, because the round food is supposed to remind us that what goes around comes around, that you may be up one day and you're down the next day. And so too, the Seder night is really a full circle of absolute slavery, death, murder, all the way up to the highest highs. But it's all part of a cycle. It's all part of one big cycle. So that's another understanding of what the egg represents. There's a bunch of them. There's a lot of them. Just like charosis means a few different things, and the matzah means a couple different things. It's a loaded night for symbolism. So it's one of those nights where you can just study and study and study. There are more Haggadahs published. There are more commentaries on the Haggadah published than any other Jewish book in existence, which tells you just how meaty the Haggadah is, how many people want to sink their teeth into it and give a shot at explaining what the night is all about.
Who actually published it? Who actually published the first Haggadah?
Oh, that's also, we don't know. We don't know who did it. We know the time frame around which they did it was the time of what's called the Gaonim, which happened after the redaction of the Talmud, but before the period of the medieval scholars like Rashi and Maimonides. So there's about 500 years there where we have only a select few writings from those rabbis, but they were very influential in the way that they shaped those communities at that time. And it was put together by what we call the Baal Haggadah, the person who wrote the Haggadah, and he put it together in a very interesting and fascinating and sometimes strange way. And what we realize after the fact is that the Haggadah was designed in order to get us to ask questions. We're supposed to be reading through the book and saying, "What on earth is this doing after that? How did this flow from what we just previously read? What are we supposed to be thinking about right now?" So rather than just skim through the Haggadah, read through it and say, does anyone understand that? Did anyone get what that's trying to teach me? Because that's lost. I'm lost on that. Yeah, sorry.
Am I correct in saying in the Torah, in the portion where Hashem tells us, look, you should remember this, you should eat matzah, he directly tells us, am I correct to say that he told us to encourage questioning in the Torah? I think I read that in one of the parashas. Right.
Well, we have the verses in the Torah that correspond to the four sons. And they all say, Ki yish'alcha bincha, when your son will ask you. What is this about? What happened at that time? It's the night of questions. It's built in. And in fact, in the Mishnah, the terse Talmudic statements made by the rabbis about 2,000 years ago. They said that the way in which we arrange the seder is designed to get children to ask questions. So, for example, when you start the seder, you have the seder plate in front of you, which back then was the plate. Everyone had a plate in front of them, on a table. And what they would do is they would take away the table and say, "Everyone ready to eat?" And they'd put a little sprig of parsley in front of everybody. And the kids are like, "What the heck is this? Is this dinner? What's going on?" And he's like, good question, right? We were slaves in Egypt, and that's how you... So, in fact, the 4 questions are only there as a necessity in case you haven't yet gotten the kids to ask questions of their own accord. So much so that the rabbis said that if they do ask questions already, naturally, you don't even need to recite the 4 questions. Now, we still do because it's part of the Seder, but the whole idea, and it says even if we were the most brilliant people, we would still stay up telling the story. It says that a person who, unfortunately, has to spend Seder night on their own has to go through the night in a question and answer format. They ask themselves questions. That's how important questions are to the night.
That's tough.
Why if the kids only ask 2 questions?
Yeah. Well, again, we go through the 4 questions, right? Because we want to cover all of our bases. And it's particularly difficult because the kids today, when they've studied the Seder, my kids have spent the last 3 weeks learning about Pesach. They know everything that's coming, so they're not asking questions anymore. So it becomes particularly difficult to get people to ask questions. So I have to be a bit inventive, They'll be sitting at the Seder table, and I'll walk in with like a wig on my head or something like that, and they'll be like, but why are you wearing a wig? Great question, because we were slaves in Egypt, right? And then we'll launch into it. So you have to get creative. Yeah.
Is it also correct? And just came up in my mind again. When I was reading the parasha, I think I remember. I'm not sure if this is correct, but like Hashem tells us that we have to tell our children that it's because we were enslaved, or that what happened to you or my ancestors.
That's right. It says it in the Haggadah. Everyone must see themselves as if they personally left Egypt. As if they personally left Egypt.
Yeah.
Now that has very, very deep spiritual implications, because it means that we are proverbially and spiritually leaving Egypt every year. There's an idea that that the exodus from Egypt occurs in the month of Nisan, which is the springtime. And we commemorate Egypt, we commemorate Passover every year at that time. Now, we tend to think that the reason why we commemorate Passover is because of the exodus from Egypt. But it's actually the other way around. The exodus from Egypt occurred during that time because that's the time that's ripe for freedom, for growth, for birth. It's the springtime. The energies were aligned such that that's what had to be done in that moment. So if you rewind a few hundred years before the exodus from Egypt, there's another episode that takes place in that month, which is when the angels came and visited Abraham. The angels came and visited Abraham in the month of Nisan. And what did Abraham make for them? He made matzah. He made matzah. What the heck was he doing making matzah? There was no Passover story. There was no running out of Egypt. And the reason why is because Abraham understood that the time of Nisan, that time of springtime, was spiritually the right time to eat this type of food.
That's the time of birth.
It is the time of birth. It's the time of getting back to the essentials. Bread and water, flour and water, and nothing else.
That one of them was there to tell him that he was going to have a kid, right?
Yeah, he was going to have a kid. He was going to destroy Sodom. The whole thing with Lot was a foreshadowing of the exodus from Egypt, if you weren't aware. Yeah.
And also Mitzrayim, doesn't that translate to bondage?
Mitzrayim is the same word for Meitzarim. A Meitzar is a narrow, a strait, something that has boundaries.
Boundaries.
Right, it's restrictive. So we are escaping our restrictions every year.
What was the last time? Did we say about the last time?
Did we say what?
I think,
I think
yeah,
we said at the time.
I remember
Oh, it
remembering
is
from a
possible
few
that we
weeks ago.
did say that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember it.
Yeah, but that's the deep work that we're supposed to be thinking about as we're cleaning out the chametz. The Talmudic sages said that the leavening in the bread is a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara, the evil inside of us. And the reason why is because the leavening of the bread puffs you up. It basically fills you up with hot air, something that adds virtually nothing to the essence of the food itself. It just makes you feel like you've got a big ego. So the leavening is the ego inside of us. It's the part of us that's got baggage and attachments, and we've got to try to let go of all of that. And true freedom is the ability to be clean, pure, with no extra added ingredients, knowing exactly who I am and nothing more. That's what it is.
Wow.
It's cool, huh? It's a cool holiday. A cool holiday.
Do you think it's more important to celebrate it this year than basically?
It's important to celebrate it every year, but
But
it becomes
emphasis.
it's far. I think it's going to be far easier to relate to what we're talking about this year, especially at the beginning of the seder. In Cain, we're going to talk about this at the seder, which is at the very beginning of the seder. We say, "This year we're slaves, and next year may we be free." There's an irony. There's a contradiction in the night, where it's a night of celebrating freedom, but we also say that we're still slaves. We're still slaves. And there's a recognition that there's always something that's not quite right about what's going on, such that every year the way that we end the Seder is, next year in Jerusalem, man, let's hope that we can do it right next year, because we don't have a lamb on a spit on Seder night. We're missing something big. So hopefully we can do it right next year.